I'm delighted to be here today with Alexander Baumgardt. He is a professor for design at the California College of the Arts. Thank you so much for joining this conversation, Alexander.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Today you had a talk at the next conference about design systems. We are talking about hugging the system, and this talk was about design systems. What is a design system?
Well, a design system is, first of all, a term that kind of emerged during the recent years when it comes to digital design. And it's basically a system of all the components of expression, mainly user interfaces, and to manage those components in a system at scale. So when new experiences are created for any kind of device, we all know them from our mobile devices, but you can also think of any other device. And it's digital components, all the building blocks that you would use to create an interface in any given context.
So could you give an example?
Yeah, of course. So an example, maybe an overused example, I still give it because we all know and love Apple. And no matter if you're using an iPhone or if you're using a tablet by Apple, you have particular interface components that behave the same, right? And this is driven by, or an Apple TV, same thing, and all it being driven by considerations of the intersection between the brand. So you know, oh, I'm on an Apple property, on an Apple product, and well, ergonomics, like, right, can I use this with my fingers when it's touch-based interfaces? And then there are also many other considerations like, for example, gestures, which is something that comes with more and more used. But ultimately, the design system is used to manage and easily to assemble new modes of interfaces for any touch point, also future ones.
I just realized that I never understood design systems in the first place. Interesting. So you have not only the assets that you have, but also the way that you interact with the interface.
Yes. So this is, that's a great question. So there's actually a term for that, which is called branded interactions. So we all know there are interactions, but then there are certain interactions that are branded and sometimes even patented, right? I don't know if you remember this from the first iPhone. When you would like refresh a page, you would kind of pull it down a little bit. That's why it was called the rubber band. You let it go, and then kind of like the content on a web page refreshes. And there are all sorts.
I remember now.
Yeah, you remember now, right? I mean, that one could not be patented because it was open source, and then Apple used it, and the designer became very famous because Apple used it. But nowadays, often these things are also made, and that would be another discussion, but like intellectual properties. But yes, so the interaction itself would be something that you can also use as a component, an interaction component. And then there are visual components, like the shape or color or other aspects of a button, for example. Yeah.
Why is it important to use these systems?
Well, the design system's main value is that it basically integrates all these different properties, assets, and components that you can manage them in a digital domain. And what does this mean in terms of value for the business? It brings in efficiencies. So, okay, I don't have to recreate a component. I can also, for example, and there is actually a term for that, which might be sounding a little nerdy now, but like I just say it. It's called a token. So let's, for example, say I have a brand color that I want to be always used consistently. So I make this a token in a system. And all the components that use that color would reference back to that one. So it's basically an object-oriented approach to componentize, right, all these experiences. Maybe a thing that is also helpful to understand is this also happened before we had digital systems, right? Like we all know, if you're old enough to have like experienced it, back in the day when we had basically brand design systems and corporate identity, right? We would have letterheads with a certain kind of grid, and the elements are somewhere, and all of this. It's pretty much the same, just at a much bigger scale. But ultimately, when you think about it from a like product development process, from pre-development, of making like prototypes, to then the development process, and later the maintaining process of a product, and then thinking about where you kind of have to maybe redesign certain aspects or add features, you always can use these components. And this means you can do this faster, you can build prototypes fast. That accelerates research, observations, insights, boom. Then kind of like time to market during the development process until you kind of can release stuff. And that's the main driver behind it. I know some designers that might listen to this right now could like, well. It's also like, creative expression and changing things and making something new. Yes, it is. But from a business perspective, this is always about efficiency.
Mm. Does it cut out certain creative processes?
No, I don't necessarily think so. I mean, this is a little bit like in the old days before the digital, and still even in the digital, one thing is, of course, is structure, right? And in the old days, in like printed design, you would have the grid, right? And there's a grid, and things are sitting somewhere in a place, and designers were like, but the grid, it constrains my creativity, it stifles me. I don't want the grid. It's like, wait a second. What we are doing here is then more closer to architecture. If I say I want to build a house, and in architecture, okay, in physical architecture, you have to adhere to physics. So you don't really want to mess with that, because otherwise you'll be buried in it. But then you could say, even now in digital properties, from an conceptual architecture perspective, you can also get buried in it, right? If it's not made consistently. So there are levels of consistency. They feel like they constrain you, but they just open up other like venues and areas in the kind of architectural stack where you actually can and should be creative. Because why would I mess with statics, right? Like of an architecture, if I rather put my creative efforts into parts of the architecture and in the building where I'm not putting its physics at stake, so to speak. I don't want to say that there are digital physics, but like, since I'm a professor, I guess I can say such obscure things.
What kind of challenges do you see when using those design systems?
Well, that like with any project, in any organization, and you would say like the design system is a product in itself, right? An internal product that you use to create great products faster, right? That solve business needs and goals and solve user/customer goals and needs. Which means multiple parts of the organization have to work together. Since we are mainly talking about digital experiences here, one of the classic challenges is the collaboration between design and development. So the designer, and I know I'm oversimplifying this, but like the designer draws a picture and describes things that are invisible, but that the user can feel, which would be behaviors that express in interactions, like the little button that does a certain thing, branded interactions. And then that needs to be, of course, to be translated in code. And there are designers that have code affinities, but not everyone has this. And this is partially due to the context that I represent, design education. But increasingly, we have more designers that are actually versed in computation and coding. But it always has been a challenge, or often has been a See, this is what I do. Like I'm saying the same thing twice in different sentences or ways. But again, back to the challenge. So the challenge between development and design. Luckily, we had certain technological advantages and movements especially in coding, so there is this whole trend, first it was called low code, so that there is basically also componentized, predetermined code, and then you don't really have to go really deep into the code, so you would be able to actually contain visible user interface elements already in that, which brought it closer together. Then even coming to no code, right? No coding needed, but still you would have, on a technical level, the challenge still, how do I bring these two things together, even though that then they can be used very easy and intuitively. And this is one of the main challenges that's happening now, because the design systems bring this efficiency. They are successful, but then they also scale. And to scale, this means everyone has to work very close together. And so, without wanting to go too deeply into this, but given, when I talked about the product development process, given the design system brings in efficiencies and value at each stage, there's not a single organizational unit that is not touched by it, right? Like branding, marketing, R&D, product development, product management, right? And even later, where it's about other touch points, product maintenance, it always goes full cycle. And what we of course want to do, if you have an internal product, a property like a design system, you want it to learn and change, right? I have my prototypes, I learn something, I get the product in the market, I learn from that, maybe want to change components. So how do we feed this back? And up to now, actually almost no management system for the design systems really takes feedback back into the system easily, manually, right? It's all output. And then it becomes often a little bit chaotic. So there is an emergence of tools where that happens. So anyone who watches this video and was also visited a session, so we had a colleague there from GitHub who was talking to how there are now emerging features where that can actually be done, so that the system ultimately can learn from how it's used in the world. And then it can be, it can be changed and it can grow, and you can create new components.
Okay.
Ooh.
I'm processing.
Yeah. No,
Where do you see this all going?
Well, right. Our conversation was about the future of design systems in the session and in this conversation. So the future is, it's a little bit of a polarizing topic. Polarizing in the sense of like, it opens up a field of tension. So anyone who listens to this and has an engineering background or looks through a design lens that looks conceptually and through an architectural lens to it. It's like, okay, so I have this component system, there are relationships, then it learns from it. Sounds a little bit like an adaptive system. So, and if the main goal is bringing efficiencies, right, to it, so it's always the most efficient it can be, so that we can be as fast as possible to make, learn, right, like evaluate, make again, learn again, and get better continuously, then the question is, how are these efficiencies brought in the future? And the answer is very simple. It's advanced computation, pattern recognition, machine learning, because if we are, and that's not mildly put, bluntly put, is that most of the components, the core components, are of any given design system are at a basic level are the same. Because why? Because the devices are the same, because the user and the human factors are the same. We do this with fingers, with hands, and so you could say, if I say all all the components that you could have as white label, you know, like without an identity of a brand, these are components that an AI system could could easily recognize and componentize as standard elements that you build from. So, and that's the challenge, because from a creative perspective, you say, but wait a second. So like, then everything will look the same. But to say, to also put it bluntly, it already does. The most differences are only on the surface layer, which is what you visually see, and then content, right? And you could say from a rational perspective, isn't that what it should be? Because, for example, if I have a news property, it's the news that should shine, and the interface shouldn't be in the way. And of course, of course, there are contexts where that would be a little differently. But my take on that is that artificial intelligence, or I'm also like many speakers on the conference, I don't really like the term, because there is no artificial intelligence, and we have not built any machine that comes close to that, and it will probably never happen. But what we can say, we have massive machine learning, which just means recognize patterns very, very well and then sort them and organize them. So for me, I always talk about this with my students. Sometimes I say, like, you look on that level, these forms, these elements, it's a little bit like, Euclidean geometry. So it's like a circle is always a circle. And I can say, like, as long as a human is touching this button, a button is always a button. Can be a little bigger, a little lower, and then it's like, but what if with a button that has a little bevel? Well, it's still a square where you have like half a circle in it. It's still just math, and that math you cannot have a circle that's not a circle. You can have it bigger or smaller, or a shape where a circle is cut out. That's it. So that means those are all elements I can basically calculate using math and computation. So. But the cool thing is, then on the higher stacks in the architecture, there are lots of things where you can make proprietary changes adhering to brand principles, these branded behaviors, movement, motion, right? Like interactive things. There are possibilities. So that means that ultimately, with the help of bringing these efficiencies in on like building me the entire house stable, right? But now I'm like, how do I furnish this? And, that's where the creativity comes in again. And even,
you win time basically to do the things that you actually creatively want to do.
Exactly. You don't want to push pixels where a machine can push the pixels. That's also a little provocative, but yes, exactly. And in some way, this kind of makes true, which sometimes I've always believed that design is sort of like philosophy, like in action, right? Like, because there's envisioning of ideas, and then we bring them into the world. And good old Socrates, he had a point of view on technology, which now seemingly possibly is coming true. So his thought on this was like, embracing the technology. When they were talking about technology, they were mostly talking about machines. But if the machines take away all the mundane tasks, then I can be a philosopher all day long. So now let's translate this to our domain of design. If the machines take away the mundane tasks, I can be a designer again. I can use this computation engine, right, that no machine can emulate yet. So the machines, they can help us on those levels, and then we can be creative again on another level.
Sounds actually quite attractive.
It sounds attractive. The only caveat is that it will be a transition, right? So this means if I say like, okay, in the next 5 to 10 years, design systems are managed in a kind of a next level systems where all these different inputs and outputs are coming together, and the machines help to kind of componentize and organize and see everything, right? Like up to a certain level. So what are then the levels, and, and what are the tools? So is this still the tool where I'm drawing something on one side, and then or have parametric kind of like dials Or do I use code again? Or do I do what we have seen currently in kind of like in imagery with Midjourney and DALL-E? Do I give it a prompt? Do I tell the system to give me something, a new interface? I don't know. What I'm expecting is that it's a combination of all of those, depending on context. But so it could also mean that we don't necessarily have to work with ultimately sit in front of a screen all day anymore, because we have seen some of these things it's a little more advanced actually in any context where you are dealing with 3D imagery, like computer games, architectural visualization. So in there, lucky or thank you to NVIDIA is very innovative there. Maybe this is a great metaphor or image to not to contrast it with, but to kind of compare it with. So what NVIDIA has done, for example, they have created a platform, it's called the Omniverse, where you can bring in, no matter what file format you have, no matter where it's coming from, assets from different 3D environments, bring it in there, and they get kind of the same code base, and which means again efficiency. So that means in processes for computer games, for visualization, but you could also say up to into the systems that we are talking about that are more rational products with certain business goals. These kinds of technologies, bringing things together, bringing efficiencies to it so that we can focus on the creativity that no machine can do, is fulfilled in there too. But for that, it means the designers need to embrace math and computation a little more. And why? Because as the core stakeholders in the system of creating design systems and the organizational system, engineers and designers need to work closely together. And I think through the changing landscape and the tools, there will also be a change in language will be happening, because there will be modes of creation that we don't have necessarily language for yet. But I think that at the intersection of design and engineering, that language can be developed, and it's also appropriate to develop it there. Because I always say, I come from an interaction design background, so where computation and coding naturally occurs, because if I can't code, I cannot bring these things in the world, no matter if it's through microprocessors in physical products or if it's software. So I think, and I always say an interaction designer is partly an engineer, partly an artist, and partly, I always say like scientist in the sense of that we conduct research, right? To substantiate what we are doing. So artist, scientist, and engineer sounds pretty cool. That sounds almost like a sorcerer. I can make everything. I can wave my, maybe, and this is the thing, right? Maybe I can wave my hands, because in architectural design, we already have the systems where you can make holograms, and you shape things in space because you're working in space. So, and maybe I leave it right there. Otherwise, we are entering spheres that like no man and no woman has encountered before.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
And I'll dig into it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.